Good morning. It is March 14th, 2019, and we are back with episode 12 of the Afrolantican Jurisprudence 6,000 Years of Extraordinary Commitment to Equal Protection by African Pre-Colonial African Statehood. Today's episode is, we'll call this Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, and more specifically, where was ancient Ethiopia and how far did her influence extend? Again, what we're going to talk about today is Queen Makeda, or otherwise known as the Queen of Sheba, or the Queen of Saba, depending on which source you look at. And so we're going to examine her reign and this legendary story of her friendship, courtship, marriage, her whatever relationship with King Solomon of Israel, to paint a more specific picture on the question of where exactly is Ethiopia, because there is a lot of controversy over whether present day Ethiopia matches up with the Ethiopia that's described in ancient historical texts. And to jump to the conclusion, it's a mixed bag. But we're going to use specifically the Kebra Nagast, Kebra, Kebra Nagast, Nagast. That is a religious text by the Coptic Church in Ethiopia, present day Ethiopia. It is also a holy document to the Rastafarian population within Africa, Jamaica, and all around the world. And it describes in a lot of detail, more detail than other religious texts, about the relationship, the meeting between Queen of Sheba, or Queen of Saba, or Makeda, the Queen of Ethiopia, and King Solomon, and the notion that they produced a child, and who would be King Menelik, who would be then the Solomonic dynasty that has ruled over Ethiopia for at least the last 1,000 years. If you believe that the argument extends to 2 or 3,000, but we believe the Kebra Nagast was written about 1000 AD and established a line of Solomonic kings that may, in fact, derive from earlier times. But we know that the Kebra Nagast was written about 1000 or 1300 AD, and is a story of the Queen of Sheba, but it's rich again in symbolism. And so what I want to take from this is, again, the story of the Queen of Sheba. It's a very interesting story. But again, we know that our purpose here is to delineate and more precisely describe pre-colonial African statehood on the one hand, and then more specifically its commitment to equal protection on the other. And here we're going to see not just the commitment to matrilineality, the commitment to matriarchy, but also the commitment to the rule of law and the idea that wisdom is greater than power. We might call the Queen of Sheba the philosopher queen, and explain that a little bit later. All right, so there's so much information. It's going to be, I try to get these things under an hour, and sometimes we go 2 hours long. So I'm going to try to get through a lot of this information within, let's say, the next 60 minutes. It's ambitious because there's just so much. And to me, it's just so exciting. I hope it's exciting to you as well. So we're just going to go through a series of questions, I guess. And the first question to get this ball rolling is, does Ethiopia, when we talk about ancient texts, Herodotus and everything, does Ethiopia refer to a country, a nation, a state? Or does it refer to a race of people? Ethiopia itself is Greek for sunburnt faces, right? The land of the sunburnt people, right? Dark-skinned people. It's very similar to Mauritania, Maur, or Moor, Morocco, right? Moor is another word for those with dark skin. And again, we always have the controversy over Kemet. We know Kemet means black. Of course, the argument is that on the one hand, it means the land of the blacks. On the other hand, others suggest that it means the land of the black soil. Note that Sudan, right, is also another name for land of the blacks. So many of these ancient historical sources definitely concern themselves with phenotype. Even if race today is biologically, phenotypically, and all that questionable, we know that phenotype was a matter of great concern. Even in the Kibra Nagas, this idea of dividing the world between Japheth, Shem, and Ham is replete throughout the book. And so so we ask the question, does the term Ethiopia, as used by 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, the word has been used several times, several places, all over the place. Does it mean a nation state, or does it mean sunburnt faces as a race of people? Is Ethiopia, more specifically, is Ethiopia synonymous with the Kushite Empire, with Kush? We talked about Kemet first. We talked about Kush second. And now we're going to talk about Ethiopia. We actually could reverse the order. We could make the claim that Ethiopia was first, and that there was a great Kushite state and empire prior to there being an ancient Kemet, right? So, but I don't feel, but the records are most replete. The records are most abundant when it comes to Egypt. So we started there, especially when we talked about the rule of law, equal protection, with the understanding that from the beginning that scholars believe that the sophisticated nature of Old Kingdom Egypt law by itself means that it was derived from an earlier time and earlier efforts at statecraft, right? So my take on it is this: while Ethiopia may sometimes refer generally to indigenous Africans, it is most often associated with a nation state controlling numerous provinces through a system of taxation and redistribution, having a fairly contiguous history, originating before and culminating in the Egyptian Old Kingdom dynasties, extending at its peak from Greece in the north to India in the east, to Kenya in the south, to points west in Africa, perhaps as far as Lake Chad and maybe even the Nox civilization of Nigeria, influencing governance structures on the African continent for the next several millennia, and at its best when adhering to the precepts of Mott, which include truth and justice and balance and order, demonstrated most clearly by the equal protection of law to all citizens, exemplified by the relatively extraordinary and exalted place of women within traditional African society. That's my position. Right? Nice long sentence. It's in contrast to, again, some people have a stronger view. Again, the belief that Ethiopians not only meant a race of people, but that this race of people, this Kushite empire that predated Egypt, was a multi-continental. So there is an author named Houston who wrote a book in the 1920s. Those Wonderful Ethiopians is fantastic work by a polemic scholar, sort of like J.A. Rogers, that did the research on their own and came up with great stuff. And they talk about how many of the things that we know now about there being mounds and pyramids and things in ancient America that go back thousands of years and seem to be correlated to megalithic structures in Africa and many different cultural affinities to African culture. However, that's why I make a very strong point about state. While I totally, if taxation is the sine qua non of the state, right, and I argue that it is, right, that when we talk about state, jurisdiction over land, a nation, a country, the essential portion of it is the ability to tax several provinces, either through voluntary allegiance or through military subjugation or subordinacy. But that is what we're going to use to define or identify a state. And if that is the essential element, then I can agree that black folks are created and originated all of the early civilizations that Houston talked about, but without Kush being a global state or a three-continent empire. In other words, I don't believe that I believe definitely that dark-skinned people, black people, however described, created these civilizations that span the globe. However, I do not believe, or there's not enough evidence for me to accept that there was a capital city, let's say in Kerma or Kush or Kustul, that laid taxes on all of these countries worldwide, right? To me, that's what would make it a nation state or an empire. So I just want to be specific about that. I do believe the actual empire of Kush, Nubia, Meroe, their power to tax and redistribute extended at times over major areas of the south of the Nile juncture at Khartoum, including present-day Ethiopia, parts of Uganda to the west, parts of Arabia to the east, and perhaps as far south and east as the coasts of India. We even have notes from the Kibra Nagas. From the middle of Jerusalem and from the north thereof to the southeast is the portion of the Emperor of Rome. And from the middle of Jerusalem, from the north thereof to the south and to western India is the portion of the Emperor of Ethiopia. Okay, so that's the first statement we're going to give, to where we have witnesses or a record of the world, and at that time, again, the Western world or the Mediterranean world being split between two great empires, the Roman Empire and the Ethiopian Empire. So the declaration that the world split between those two should give you a really, 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 really intense sense of pride and recognition of how great of a people black folks were, Africans are. Second question, was Ethiopia, so the question that leads to the second question, was Ethiopia synonymous with Kush, such that the present day Ethiopia and perhaps Yemen, Southern Arabia, and other parts were part of the southeastern portion of the Kushite Empire? Okay, so in a second, we're going to have to take you back to what we talked about with ancient Nubia and ancient Kush. Again, one of the reasons why we talked about that before coming here is to give us a frame of reference. But again, question one is, where was ancient Kush? Let's deal with, let's take a statement from Herodotus, the Greek quote-unquote father of history. Interesting thing about Herodotus being the father of history. Again, when he says good things, when he says good things about other people or whatever, he's known as the father of history. When he says good things about Africans and what have you, then he's called the father of lies. Well, here's a lie for you if this is a lie. Herodotus says, the Egyptians believe themselves the oldest of all men. Now, he's writing this around 600 BC, right? 600 BC, which is about over 1,600 years before I even believe the Kibra Nagas, even 2,000 years before the Kibra Nagas is written. The Egyptians believe themselves the oldest of all men. And guess what? They're right. Right? So now that all the scientific evidence is in, 2,000 years later, the cradle of civilization, the very first person, Lucy, however you want to describe, the first Homo sapien or whatever, is found basically in Ethiopia, the cradle of civilization. So it's been one of those things that's been discovered in the 20th century that was known over 2,000 years ago. Not only were the Ethiopians right, the Ethiopians believe themselves the oldest men, not only were they right, all the Egyptian gods came from Nubia. So when we talk about Ammon and Set and Osiris, Dionysus and all that, the records show that they came from Nubia. They are records of, again, we're talking about ancestor worship. And so these are people that founded cities, became gods, and then revered for thousands of years after, but all the stories suggest that they came up to Egypt from the south. And then once there, again, the god of Africa, Ammon, becomes almost universal, right? So it becomes Baal Ammon, Zeus Ammon, Jupiter Ammon. And again, we'll talk about the presence of Ammon or Amen in the Bible. So we have this ancient, I guess, priority of Ethiopia and Nubia with the gods and the belief in that civilization is coming down the Nile, right? That again, the Nile Valley culture, the Nile comes off of the Nile being the longest river in the world, that it overflows and floods every year, and that when it recedes, the land is very fertile near the river, and that it produces an abundance of agriculture that can support large societies, and then, of course, that surplus can be taxed and redistributed to others. And we know that the Nile, again, starts in the White Nile and the Blue Nile, right? The White Nile is in Uganda. The Blue Nile begins in the highlands of Ethiopia. They come together in Khartoum, which is in now present-day Sudan. Then as the Nile flows down, right, from Meroe, Napata, Kerma, Kastul, Wawat, Thebes, all the way down to the delta and lets out into the Mediterranean. And so the argument becomes, was all of that at one time Kush, right? And not just the northern part, because we know it was, right, that the 25th dynasty, we know that they had conquered all of not just Nubia, but also Egypt, also West Asia, right, the Levant, all the way up to Asia Minor, which is present-day Turkey, and perhaps and likely the Aegean Peninsula, where the Mycenaean or Greek civilization was. And again, we have evidence that extended all the way to India. But what's neglected is how far south did it go? How about southern Arabia? How about Persia? How about southern India? How about down the coast of Africa and all the way over to Lake Chad and Niger? So there's less records about this, but it causes one to wonder how an empire from north central East Africa can control areas in Western Asia, Southern Europe, the whole Mediterranean. One would think that they also would have very intense relations with the African South. And we know that trade with the South, the luxury goods, the items, the gold, right, especially the gold, were premium products. They were highly sought after. The wealth of Egypt, the wealth of Kush emanates from their ability to extract all of these goods and natural resources and exchange them for more crafted goods elsewhere. So that begs the question, where is present-day Ethiopia the Ethiopia that's discussed in historical texts? And the answer seems to be yes and no, that Ethiopia as present today, if you believe, could be just more or less the southeastern part of the Kushite Empire. At least that's what's believed by the Emperor Haile Selassie I, who is, of course, God Jah Rastafari to the Rastafarian nation, the King of Kings, Lords of Lords. And in the earlier 20th century, when taking over that country, it was called Abyssinia. He converted the name from Abyssinia to Ethiopia and declared that, yes, that the Abyssinians, in other words, the people that came over from Western Asia, the people that came over from Arabia that established themselves, were a minority part of the Ethiopian nation, that the vast majority of Ethiopia is bound together by language, which is a Cushitic Nilotic language, that the language of that's called Ge'ez or Ge'ez or Ge'ez, G-E-E-Z, is only an ecclesiastical language like Latin in America. It's only used in the church. All the people speak a Cushitic language, right? Because again, it would seem that those people are derived from the southeastern branch of the Kushite Empire, the Ethiopian Empire. Not just language, it's all the same, more or less, culture. So even if we had different names, if you went from East Africa, from Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, all the way up the Red Sea, right? We have the Nile River, but don't forget the Red Sea is on this side too, less than a couple hundred miles away, leading all the way up to the Mediterranean. And the people on the African side were all what's called East African pastoralists. In other words, they were cattle culture. The agriculture was along the Nile River, but then outside, between the Nile River and the Red Sea, you had more people that had cattle, right? Pastoralists. And so the blending of these of pastoralist culture, agriculture, then we had craft culture, then you had trading from different areas. All of that made for a more complete nation, because again, the idea of taxation in those times are, I'm going to take a little piece from you, a piece from you, a piece from your province, a piece from your province, and then we're going to redistribute that stuff so that the agriculturists will have cattle, we'll have beef, we'll have meat. The pastoralists will have agriculture. The crafts will all be spread around. The gold and all that, the things that, the pottery, the things that we get from other nations will all be spread around by this system of taxation and redistribution. The idea, and how do we get to present day Ethiopia if present day Ethiopia is distinct, or at least somewhat similar, or was a former province of Kush? Let's first deal with the name Punt. There are folks who believe that even if Ethiopia, or present day Ethiopia, was part of the Kush Empire, that it was referred to in the Bible as Punt. And that when Hatshepsut made her voyages to Punt, that she was going down to Ethiopia. I think that's plausible, but I think from an Afrocentric viewpoint, I think that's limited. While we're not sure one way or the other, our uncertainness means that we should limit the possibilities, and the possibilities are that Punt was even as far as Kenya, and that that ancient Africans in the Nile Valley traveled not only all the way down the Nile River to Uganda, but all the way down the Blue Nile to Ethiopia, then all the way down the Red Sea to basically Kenya, Tanzania, and perhaps all the way down to Sofala, the great gold mines of southern Africa. We'll deal with that in another episode, but just know that we spend so much time talking about Ethiopia and Nubia's relationship with Egypt and with Israel or Palestine or whatnot, that we neglect the fact that it is very likely that they had not just trade and not just relations, but perhaps sovereignty over areas to their south as grand and as far distant than those to the north. So we know, so we can start with the idea that in Ethiopian peoples, again going back to Professor Houston, that in Ethiopian peoples of varied cultures ruled different places of the world prior to the Egyptian dynasties, right? We have the Hindu Kush mountains in India. You have those. She mentions Atlantis, which a lot of people right now believe was a nation that was based out of Mauritania or Morocco. She talks about the pyramids in Americas, but again, I am hesitant to call that part of the Kushite Empire. The Kushite Empire, or the Ethiopian Empire that I will refer to again, is the pretty clear evidence that Nubia, Custul, the cemeteries at Custul, predated the Egyptian dynasties by several generations. And so the idea that the Northeast Africa, the Nile Valley, the Levant and all that, Elam, Odom, a lot of the different societies, or Sumer, these civilizations that were 2,000 and 3,000, 4,000 BC, were dark-skinned African peoples or derived from African peoples that had just previously left the continent and probably were involved in, again, the system of taxation and trade back to the quote-unquote motherland. So that would be the establishment of the Kushite Empire. It would seem to have waned while Egypt takes priority in the Old Kingdom, and then it would seem after the Old Kingdom and perhaps the Middle Kingdom, which will lead us to about 1500 AD, 2000 to 1500 BC. At that time, the Nubian or the Kushite Empire reemerges as perhaps more preeminent than Egypt at that time, right? And so we have the basis of Northeast African civilization at Thebes, but then back to, it moves back to Kerma, but then it moves back to Napata, but then it moves back to Meroe. All of this leading us up to basically about 300 AD, right? These are the stages of the Kush Empire. And we know that, again, the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, the Assyrians, they keep coming into the Nile Valley from the north and perhaps pushing the Kushite Empire farther and farther and farther back to the south. And to the point where now we're in 370 AD, and King Azana from Adulis, or so-called Axum, a city right on the edge or the Horn of Africa by the Red Sea, which basically connects the Red Sea to Arabia, right down at that bottom southern point, that they come up to Meroe, the capital of Nubia, and conquer it, and bring basically the Ethiopian Empire becomes sited out of Axum. Right? So now Ethiopia or Axum becomes the preeminent African state when it comes to world trade, and that persists for quite some time. We have the Kushite Empire, then to Axum, then to Christian Axum. At the time that they conquer Nubia in 370, they adopt the Christian religion, and also Nubia adopts Christian religion. So it's not even clear that we're talking about necessarily a straight up conquering. However, that didn't. That's around 350 to 400 to 500 AD. Then we have the advent of Islam in Arabia, which is right across the Red Sea. And we know that Islam is established with the help of Ethiopian armies, right? Ethiopian is still a major power in the 7th century AD. But as Islam grows, the power of Ethiopia starts to wane. And as a matter of fact, it becomes more Asiatic. This is at the point where we believe that those Arabians or so-called Semites from the Arabian Peninsula and Levant start to migrate into Ethiopia and change the character somewhat. But at that same time, we have a woman who returns as queen in around the year 960. Her name is Judith, and she reigns. So African matriarchy returns for another 40 years before her dynasty is removed, and we have the installation of the Zagwe dynasty and then the Solomonic dynasties after that. And the interesting thing about the Solomonic dynasties is that almost all of them have been kings, and they base this notion of kingship and patriarchal or patrilineal power succession off of what we're going to discuss later, the Kebra Nagast. Even still, some queens still seem to surface, but compared to prior to the Kebra Nagast, compared to the queens of Ethiopia, the Kandakis, compared to Judith, the queen of Ethiopia in 960, compared to this queen of Sheba that we're going to discuss, the tides have turned, and matriarchy in Ethiopia has been circumscribed a great deal over the last 1,000 years, consistent with the march of global white supremacy. Okay, so who was the mysterious Queen of Sheba, otherwise known as the Queen of Saba, otherwise known as Queen Makeda? First of all, where is Saba? And then again, that starts the controversy. Sheba, Saba is the same thing, and Saba is assumed to be Yemen in southern Arabia. So those that don't want Queen of Sheba to be African, they don't want her to be black, will claim that she is the queen of the south, meaning Yemen, neglecting the fact that at that time Yemen was probably a protectorate or province of the Ethiopian empires, or the Nubian empires, or the Kushite empires, or even the Egyptian empires at that time. It later becomes part of Arabian power, and Middle Eastern, whatever you want to call it, part of a Middle Eastern culture that dominates, and is to this day under Islam. But at the time, at the Queen of Sheba, and we'll talk about time later, a little bit later, it's very interesting because Saba is also described in some texts as Meroe or Nubia. So where Saba is controversial, and that's one of the reasons why we're going to go through the Kibra Nagas, and I'll go for that in a minute. The facts support, in my view, African preeminence and dominance over that region for thousands of years prior to the current millennium. So it's much more likely that Axum or Dualis was part of an affiliated Nile Valley civilization and established colonies in Arabia, just as was created in the Levant prior to the emergence of global white supremacy. Okay, so Egypt, Kush are known to have established colonies in Palestine and other places, and we believe the same thing has occurred in Arabia to establish Saba. So to call her the Queen of Ethiopia or to call her the Queen of Saba probably means the same thing. Again, this idea of taxation. I am the Queen of Ethiopia, but to the extent you are a province within our country and that we're able to tax you, yeah, you're mine too. The Kibra Nagast places the Queen of Sheba on the African side of the Red Sea, and is unclear where we would find Dibra Makeda, the capital of Ethiopia, under Queen Makeda. Now, there's several versions of this Queen of Sheba and Solomon story, and all of them, as you might know about history, they're all self-serving. None of them represent the truth. They represent a narrative that aggrandizes or glorifies the people writing it, right? You've heard the proverb, African proverb, that until the lion writes the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Well, that's the case here, right? Jewish sources will glorify Israel. Islamic sources will glorify Arabs and others, and basically take a very short view of women and very short view of Africans. Even the Coptic version, you would think the Coptic version could serve as the Afrocentric version, but that's why I think African matriarchy is such an important concept to highlight, because the Coptic version is entirely 100% at odds with African cultural unity with respect to matrilineality and matriarchy. I shouldn't say 100%, because the interesting thing is, to get to patrilineality, they have to go through matriarchy. They have to respect it, which is weird. But again, an Afrocentric take to me would be distinct even from a Coptic one. And again, the Coptic version, or the Kibra Nagas, it seeks to aggrandize the Bible. It seeks to aggrandize the children of Israel and others that participated in the creation of those narratives, those stories. And so I believe an Afrocentric one is needed because as those versions glorify and aggrandize those folks, we take them all together to try to piece together where the truth lay. But how can we do that if one side is missing? Right? So Afrocentricity is not necessarily an assertion of the truth. Afrocentricity is a presentation of a version, right, that just like anyone else's seeks to, again, yes, glorify the things that we've done in the past that are great. Why? Because no one else is going to do it, right? When other people are going to write the history, and describe us, they're going to describe us in terms that glorify themselves. We see this in the Oscars and in movies all the time. So it's necessary for us to tell our own stories, not because whatever I say becomes truth, but because that hypothesis that Kush extended to all these places, the hypothesis that Ethiopia extended to these places is not even made unless there's an Afrocentric version for us to then take the facts and see if they match up, if they align. All right, so let's start with the Queen of Sheba from the Christian Bible, right? Let's start with and it's easy to do that because it's very simple. She's described. There's not a long story about her, but in the book of Acts and other places, the Queen of Sheba hears of Solomon's wisdom, right? King Solomon is the king of Israel. He is descendant of many other prophets from Abraham on down. She decides to pay him a visit. She does. She asks him lots of questions and is satisfied and very impressed with his answers. She lavishes him with gifts. And then she goes back to Ethiopia. Not a real detailed story, but other versions, right? The Arab version, the Jewish version, have them as lovers, right? That Solomon and Sheba married, or at least laid together, or at least had some type of relationship. And in the Kebra Nagast, or the Coptic version, actually produced a child, King Menelik, who becomes the king of Ethiopia and Israel, and we'll talk about that in a second, for whom the Solomonic dynasty runs through for the last 1,000 years. So the emperors of, even Haile Selassie claims to be part of that Solomonic dynasty. So the first question is, before we even get to Sheba, is who was Solomon, right? Let me just quote a few things. Again, this is from the Kebra Nagast, not the Bible, but from the Kebra Nagast. For those who were wont to see Solomon held him in complete affection, and he became their teacher. And because of his wisdom and excellence, those who had once come to him did not wish to leave him and go away from him. Now, here's another part to Solomon. Solomon was believed to have slept with, sex with like 1,000 women, right? I mean, he's supposed to be super playboy. But if we meld those two stories together, it causes me to ask, was Solomon a teacher? Right? Again, if we place ourselves 3,000 years ago, we didn't have the same university systems that we had today, right? So to go and learn about governance, to learn about science, right? Learn about metallurgy. It's not even clear how education occurred back then. But these passages where all of these people seem to praise Solomon for his wisdom from all these different parts and places suggests that he was a teacher, or not just a teacher, but the operator of a school or a university or a college or something, where he is revered by people near and far who send folks to him to be educated. Right? Because of his wisdom and excellence, those who had come to him did not wish to leave him and go away from him. All right, well, there's some other passages that we'll also refer to that seem to suggest that he is something of more a teacher than a lover. Again, the part that makes him a lover and so in charge and so sought after, again, maybe self-serving narrative of those who have written it. Now, going back to Queen Makeda, I think one of the things we're going to learn about her is, even though there's the argument that the Kebra Nagast paints it as a very beautiful love affair between Sheba and Solomon. Right? The Bible says she comes, she asks a bunch of questions of a teacher, perhaps, of a philosopher, almost like Plato and Socrates, and you're going to hear about the wisdom of Queen Makeda later that even makes this more real. But she's asking questions like Plato and Socrates and what have you, and Aristotle and them, to a wiser or philosopher, even though her questions seem to be a little more erudite than his answers. But we'll leave that to others. But again, in the Bible, it's a very student-teacher seemingly relationship. In the Kibra Nagas, it's a beautiful love affair, right? The Queen of Makeda of Ethiopia, she's named the Queen of Ethiopia. She's named Makeda in the Kibra Nagas over and over and over and over again. So they don't make any bones about where the south is, that she is the Queen of Ethiopia. She visits King Solomon of Israel. They have a love affair. But then she returns to Ethiopia and bears his son. So even though they have a love affair, she doesn't stay in Israel. She doesn't marry him and then become part of, quote unquote, his house, right? So again, this is telling you, we're setting up how badass African queens are at this point. She remains queen for 22 more years, whereafter her son Menelik returns twice to Israel to again learn from Solomon, and then again to be crowned king of Judah. But then returns to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant, right, and many first sons of Israel. And I'll talk about later about what this means to return with the Ark of the Covenant and many of the first sons of Israel. I think there's something else going on here. Whereupon Queen Makeda not only makes Menelik the king of Ethiopia, but she, for some unknown reason, considering how well things have worked out, also ordains that Ethiopia shall never again be ruled by a queen. So once Menelik takes the throne with the Ark of the Covenant and becomes a Christian nation, never to be ruled again by a queen. That is really the essence of the Kibra Nagas. That is what it's trying to get to establish, again, the Christian religion in Ethiopia and to reverse the patterns of matriarchy and matrilineality into a patriarchal and a patrifocal system that is consistent with the Levant in Palestine and Israel and in those northern or Asiatic peoples and their vision of statecraft. And it's interesting that this occurs this emphasis on only having male kings occurs when? After the reign of Judith. Right after Ethiopia or Axum is a Christian nation, but then reverts to the old ways and is ruled by an African queen named Judith for 40 years. After the Abyssinians reclaim Ethiopia, the Kibra Nagas is written, collecting all of these sources from different time periods, and you'll see the story is very melded. But the overall point clearly is to establish a new religion that is patrilineal, patrifocal, that establishes its laws, and that rejects African cultural unity, at least in the dynamic of having queen mothers and basically queen monarchs. According to the Kibra Nagas, this queen of the south was very beautiful in face, and her stature was superb, and her understanding and intelligence, which God had given her, were of such high character. Moreover, she was exceedingly rich, for God had given her glory, and riches, and gold, and silver, and splendid apparel, and camels, and slaves, and trading men or merchants, and they carried on her business and trafficked for her by sea and by land, and in India and in Aswan. Again, you know how I feel, or at least I'm going to tell you how I feel about these traders and merchants that work for the queen. Okay, well, before we go there, so the love affair commences. So she's exceedingly wealthy, exceedingly beautiful, intelligent, and what have you, but she hears about this King Solomon and note this flirtatiousness, right? So she goes to Israel. She asks a bunch of questions. She stays for quite a long time. Again, I can recharacterize this, but let's assume that she goes as a student to hear from Solomon, but they have a courtship. And so here's his mat to her, right? This is kind of funny if you read it the way I read it. And Solomon answered and said unto her, I swear, and this is about her spending the night or staying over. I swear unto thee that I will not take thee by force. This is Solomon to her. I swear unto thee that I will not take thee by force, but thou must swear unto me that thou wilt not take by force anything that is in my house. And the queen laughed and said unto him, being a wise man, why dost thou speak as a fool? Shall I steal anything, and shall I carry out the house, or shall I carry out of the house of the king that which the king hath not given to me? Do not imagine that I have come hither through love of riches. Moreover, my own kingdom is as wealthy as thine, and there is nothing which I wish for that I lack. Assuredly, I have only come in quest of thy wisdom. Stop playing, dude, right? That's the Queen of Sheba, as written in the Kebra Nagast. Witty, right? Intelligent, right? Not needy, right? Clearly with our own wealth, such that you don't even you can't even give me a gift. There's a skit by Paul Mooney, the comedian Paul Mooney, about Cleopatra and her unwillingness to accept a gift from Caesar for the very same reasons, right? That I am the queen of Ethiopia, or I'm the queen of Egypt, or whatever. That in Africa I have everything that I need, right? So again, we're showing how the view of Africans is so very different than it is perhaps today. She returns to Ethiopia after staying in Israel. Again, even if they slept together, even if they have a child or whatever the truth of the matter is, she doesn't stay. She is not his property. She is not given over to him to be his queen or princess or what have you. And we'll see later that he does actually take a princess or a queen, but it ain't Makeda. She returns to Ethiopia. When she came to her own country with great pomp and ceremony, and her officers who had remained there brought gifts to their mistress and made obeisance to her, and did homage to her, and all the borders of the country rejoiced at her coming. Right, all the borders of the country rejoiced at her coming. Those who were nobles among them she arrayed in splendid apparel, and to some she gave gold and silver and hyacinthine and purple robes, and she gave them all manner of things that could be desired. And she ordered her kingdom aright, and none disobeyed her command, for she loved wisdom, and God strengthened her kingdom. Right, this is how powerful she is as a queen. And again, she is named as, in the Kebra Nagast, not as the queen of the south, but the queen of Ethiopia. Now, we got a fundamental chronological problem here, right? And that's dealing with all these myths. When is all this stuff occurring, right? Because again, it seems to be a melding of several different stories, right? There's a fundamental chronological problem, is that if we accept that King Solomon reigned around 950 BC, that Axum or Adulis, if we assume that's where Debra Makeda is, was not known to be a Jewish or Hebrew nation state prior to 0 AD, and had not adopted Christianity until 370 AD. So the idea that the Ark of the Covenant is taken from Israel or Judah in 900 BC and moved to Axum, it's hard, right? Not impossible, but it's hard to fathom, although there's a lot of history about Cush being the protector of Judah, being the protector of Israel. And if my hypothesis is correct that we're going to get you later, then it's possible maybe one of the queens of Ethiopia, whether her name was Makeda or not, maybe this is cultural memory, that one of the queens of Ethiopia didn't in fact tax the Jewish people, or the Israel, or the country of Judah, and did in fact lay as taxes the collection of the Ark of the Covenant along with other things, and brought it back to Ethiopia, back to Africa. There's a strong belief that, and also consider this, remember again Akhenaten, There's many people believe that, again, the story of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus resembles Osiris, Isis, and Horus. That Akhenaten was trying to set up his own holy trinity with basically Akhenaten, his wife Nefertari, and their son Tutankhamun. That again, they were trying to establish another holy trinity. That this again was an attempt to establish a new people through Makeda, Solomon, and the son Menelik. Right, this new Osiris, Isis, and Horus. Right. There is one clue in the Keeping the Gas. It does say something about a King Justinius of Rome and a King Caleb of Ethiopia. And so we can do some more research on who those people were to try to give us a time period. But honestly, when we take all the facts together with the Keeping the Gas, it is still a story that was written over 1,000 to 2,000 years before the actual events, and seems to be a melding of a lot of the events that were there together. So this story from the Keeper Nagast about this love story, about this love story between Solomon and Sheba and Makeda, her returning to Ethiopia, her having a child, that child then going back to Israel, becoming the king of Israel, collecting the Ark of the Covenant, returning to Africa or to Ethiopia, and then establishing the Solomonic dynasty in ancient Ethiopia. What does all this symbolize? It symbolizes a lot of things, right? First of all, it symbolizes that Ethiopia and Axum are the continuation of the great empire of Kush, for she is often referred to as a Kandaki, the queen of Ethiopia, right? Queen Candace. We made a big deal about the Kandakis, about Nubia and ancient Kush being way ahead of its time when it comes to female rulers. And here the Keeper Nagast makes mention over and over and over and over and over again that Sheba is a Candace. So even if she is ruling, even if she is the ruler of Yemen, even if she is the ruler of Saba in the south, that just means that she would be the queen of Ethiopia or the queen of Kush, that empire that has within its provinces Saba, and therefore can tax it. The Queen Makeda in the Keeper Nagast symbolizes the continuation and the legacy of Mot, right? Note that again, it's within the text is an assertion, her intelligence and her attraction. It's a sapiosexual attraction to Solomon, if there was one, right? The wisdom, the intelligence is what becomes attractive to her, not power or might or strength. Listen to her speak about wisdom over power, and see if this sounds a lot like the legacy of Mot. And the queen said unto them, I'm going to try to read it fast because I know we can't be here all day. Hearken, O ye who are my people, and give ye ear to my words, for I desire wisdom, and my heart seeketh to find understanding. I am smitten with the love of wisdom, and I am constrained by the cords of understanding. For wisdom is far better than treasure of gold and silver, and wisdom is the best of everything that hath been created on the earth. Now unto what under the heaven shall wisdom be compared? It is sweeter than honey. It maketh one to rejoice more than wine, and it illumineth more than the sun, and it is to be loved more than precious stone. It fatteneth more than oil, and it satisfieth more than dainty meats, and it giveth a man more renown than thousands of gold and silver. It is a source of joy for the heart, and a bright and shining light for the eyes, and a giver of speed to the feet, a shield for the breast, a helmet for the head, chain work for the neck, a belt for the loins. It maketh the heart ears to hear, the hearts to understand. It is a teacher of those who are learned, and it is a consoler of those who are discreet and prudent. It goes on. It goes on. Wisdom is the best of all treasures. I follow the footprints of wisdom, and she shall protect me forever. I follow the footprints of wisdom, and she shall protect me forever. Again, following the legacy of Mot, who is again a female god. And because of the wickedness of those who do evil, the righteous are praised, and because of the wicked acts of fools, the wise are beloved. Wisdom is an exalted thing and a rich thing. I would love her like a mother, and she shall embrace me like her child. I will seek asylum with her, and she shall be unto me power and strength. I will lean upon her. I will rejoice in her, and she shall be unto me abundant grace. For it is right for us to follow the footprints of wisdom, and for the soles of our feet to stand upon the threshold of the gates of witness. Let us seek her, and we shall find her. Let us love her, and she will not withdraw herself from us. Let us pursue her, and we shall overtake her. Let us ask, and we shall receive. Now again, I make a big deal of this because, again, this is coming out of a text that will insist at the very end that no woman can be queen after Queen Makeda ordains it so, right? But even in such a text, her wisdom as a philosopher queen is unparalleled. And note that after this long soliloquy by the Queen Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, about the importance of wisdom and knowledge and understanding, although thou dost not know the God of Israel, hast this wisdom which thou hast made to grow in thine heart. That's Solomon to her, right? So again, even though this is a Christian document, it acknowledges that her knowledge predates her conversion to Christianity. Right, so her knowledge does not come from Solomon. It does not come from the Bible. So it is fair for us to assume that she is carrying forth the legacy of Mot that was developed in Cush and Kemet. Even more of her speeches, and she goes through a lot of them in the Kebra Nagast. She's presented as this very beautiful, highly intelligent queen. Her speeches on wisdom remind one of the tale of the eloquent peasant. They remind you of the teachings of Tahopatep that we talked about in episodes 4 or 5, I believe. She seems wiser than Solomon. She seems even wealthier than Solomon, which is confirmed by the archaeology. So now that we've read all the text of ancient antiquities, now the scientists are going through the archaeology to find in their tombs and their houses, does that match what you described? And they're finding so much wealth in African graves and tombs and cemeteries, but not as much wealth in Middle Eastern or Western Asiatic tombs and cemeteries and whatnot, which again suggests that there was a priority of Africans, even though the written record glorifies who? The hunter. In respect of Mot and EPC and the rule of law, she states, be patient in respect of wrath, and at the end he will make thee to rejoice. Love righteousness, and he will make life to blossom for thee. Be a good man to the good and a reprover of sinners, and put aside the wickedness of the evil man by rebuking and correcting him, and condemn and disgrace the evil man who doeth violence to his neighbor in the court of law. And do justice to the poor man and to the orphans, and release them from the hand of him that doeth them wrong. Remember the tale of the eloquent peasant? Let me say that again. Remember the tale of Kunanut. And do justice to the poor man and to the orphans, and release them from the hand of him that doeth them wrong. Precisely referring to Kunanut. And deliver him that is forsaken and the man who is in misery, and release him from the hand of him that causeth to suffer. Judge not with partiality, and have no respect of persons, but judge righteously. When you undertake to judge, love not gifts, and accept not persons. And admonish thy governors that they be free from taking of gifts, and that they accept not the persons of their friends, or of their enemies, or of the rich, or of poor, in giving judgment, and they shall surely judge their neighbors in righteousness and with a just judgment. Again, the rule of law is hugely important in ancient African societies, and any suggestion to the contrary is just flat out wrong. Queen Makeda in the Kebra Nagast symbolizes, again, a commitment to African matriarchy. Again, she is, let me give you a quote again about her being named the Queen of Ethiopia. Now, there was a law in the country of Ethiopia that only a woman should reign, and that she must be a virgin who had never known man. But the queen said unto Solomon, henceforward a man who is of thy seed shall reign, and a woman shall never more reign, only seed of thine, and this seed after him from generation to generation. Now again, the Kebra Nagast gives absolutely no reason for her to abdicate the throne individually and for all time, especially after her recitations of wisdom and about the rule of law and good judging. So again, the interesting thing about this is it seems to insist that the only way people are going to respect a rule that only men can be king is only if it came from the queen. only if it came from the original Queen Mother, who was not just the Queen of Axum, but the Queen of Ethiopia, the Queen of all of quote unquote Black Africa, who was queen over half the world as compared to the kings of Rome, right? That becomes the original Queen Mother, whose edict must be respected, and there after that there can be no queens, right? There can only be queens. Why? Because the Queen Mother says so. It's wild. But even so, we know whether Queen Makeda lived in 1000 BC, 500 BC, 500 AD. Regardless, we know that there have been queens of Ethiopia since then. And again, the remarkable story of Judith. You may, if you look her up, also look under G, not just Judith, Judith, but also look under Judith, Gudit. She's often referred to as Judith or Gudit, Gudit. You may find her more readily if you use that name. The Kibra Nagash represents the politics of marriage. So regardless of whether it's the Kibra Nagash or the Quran or the Bible, know that marriages back then were highly political. If I can get one of your princesses to marry my child and come to my kingdom, right? That means that when someone dies in your kingdom, I may be able to force one of my people, now she's married to my son or daughter, or I'm sorry, son, that maybe I can get that child who is sympathetic to us to be now ruler over your kingdom, right? And vice versa, that perhaps if Solomon marrying Makeda could possibly give him sovereignty over Ethiopia, just as Makeda's marrying Solomon could possibly give her priority or sovereignty over the Levant. And so I argue that it is probably a cleaner, crisper, less the facts suggest that Queen Makeda is seeking out Solomon to possibly be her quote-unquote consort or viceroy over the Western Asian or the eastern parts of the empire. Again, recall that Rome rules the north, Ethiopia rules the south, and according to Kibra Nagash, they have a split between them. But who rules over Asia towards India? And recall also that Queen Amani-Reines and and Caesar Augustus met in Egypt and clashed and had to set up a border between the two and say, you can't tax me south of this, and you control north of that. So there's a competition between Ethiopia and Rome. And so the question becomes, is Makeda, from an Afrocentric perspective, is she the greater power? Is she the wealthier power who is now basically trying to recruit Solomon because she's heard of his wisdom and having him be the viceroy of territories to the west? So basically, your intelligence, our armies, we can conquer the world type of thing. And this is not unusual. You may recall we talked about King Tut. After the fall of Akhenaten and the return of the monarchy or the seat of government in Kemet back to Thebes, one of Tut's wives didn't want to go along with that. And she sent a letter to the Hittites. She sent 2 letters to the Hittites and said, send me a prince that I can marry and we can rule over Kemet, that we can rule over Egypt. So this is how these marriages often go, that they are very political in nature. Also know that the Queen of Ethiopia prior to Haile Selassie also had a consort who was not king. She was married to someone, but that marriage does not make the man the king. It just makes her the queen's husband, right? Again, so this idea of the politics of marriage, the idea of African matriarchy, the idea that women do not become the property of men they sleep with or marry or what have you, that they have the rights to property and power on their own accord. Okay, so those are lots of things that I think the Kibra Nagash symbolizes, even if it is not can't be read as a historical fact. There are historical facts in it, right, that are weaved together to make a story that is in some places believable, in some places unbelievable. But as I read it, again, it causes me to see the situation much differently than those who have authored texts on in the past. I believe that yes, that Queen Makeda is the Queen of Ethiopia, that her state includes provinces that include present-day Ethiopia, or the southeast portion of the Nile River, the Blue Nile, that her empire includes southern Arabia, including Yemen, which at that time is called Saba, that she does in fact visit Israel or Judah, but to me, I interpret that as her making her yearly tour, and this is how taxation would occur. Pharaohs and kings and queens would tour with their armies into these disparate and distant lands, and they would collect goods from those who would agree. Right? We're telling you we're coming, and kind of a get down or lay down. If you get down, we're going to lavish you with gifts. We're going to make you look spectacular. We're going to come through with so much pomp and circumstance and ceremony and beauty and singers and music, and it's going to be such a festival. And if you're down with us, we're going to give you stuff that you don't have in your kingdom, and especially for the nobles and the people that rule it. But in exchange, you're going to give to us the things that you make: vases, pottery, silver, copper, what have you. And everything's going to go smooth if you agree. If you don't agree, we will then take you out. Right? And so the question to me here is, or the story to me suggests, that Queen Makeda is going on these tours, and when she gets to Israel, this is a very important place for her to stop by, because the taxation here would be very lucrative, and in order to expand the empire, that she would connect with the King of Solomon and have him serve as basically the ruler of lands to the east, or lands to the northeast. What makes me think that? Well, let's start with several different circumstances. Number one, let's consider the role of a man named Tamarin. Tamarin is called a merchant. He is one of Queen Makeda's merchants. But of course, what do I think he is? One of her tax collectors. The queen of the south shall rise up on the day of judgment, and shall dispute with and condemn and overcome this generation who would not hearken unto the preachings of my word. And the queen of the south whom he spake was the queen of Ethiopia. And in the words ends of the earth, he maketh allusion to the delicacy of the constitution of women, and the long distance of the journey, and the burning heat of the sun, and the hunger on the way, and the thirst for water. And this queen of the south was very beautiful in face, and her stature was superb, and her understanding and intelligence which God had given her was of such high character, that she went to Jerusalem to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Now this was done by the command of God, and it was a good pleasure. And moreover, she was exceedingly rich, for God had given her glory and riches, and gold and silver and splendid apparel. And they carried her business and trafficked for her by sea and by land, in India and in Aswan. Okay, so the interesting thing about, to me, is even if this Makeda is a mythical Makeda, the idea that a queen of Ethiopia rules such places, to me, is a reference to fact. How long ago? How long did that reign occur? Not sure. And he rose and went. And there wasn't, this is referring again to Tamarin, another passage referring to Tamarin, one of the Queen Makeda's officials, one of the government officials. There was an Ethiopian, a eunuch, a court official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of all her treasure. Okay. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning, seated in his chariot, and he was reading the prophet Isaiah, and the Spirit said to Philip, go over and join this chariot. So Philip ran to him and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet, and asked, do you understand what you're reading? And he said, how can I, unless someone guides me? And he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. So after they had a long discussion, Tamarin bade him farewell, and went forth and journeyed along his road, and came to his lady, and delivered over to her all the possessions which he had brought. So my point here is, again, that number one, Tamarin is a court official. I believe he is a tax collector. This idea that he's a merchant suggests private enterprise. But listen to this last statement again. And came to his lady and delivered over to her all the possessions which he had brought. He's the tax collector. He's taxing folks on her behalf. And then he tells her about this kingdom. And so that's what excites her about making the tour personally, to make sure that they form an alliance. The Kibra Nagast, it identifies other territories held by Ethiopia. So again, this idea that Judah would be a territorial state or a province is not extraordinary. And recall that Rome, Greece, Persia, Egypt are all competing for these territories to subjugate them, to bring them into the realm. Listen to this quote. And then they loaded their wagons, and they rose up and departed, and journeyed unto the land of Medium. And they came, and Medium could be Yam, right? And they came into the country of Belantos, which is a country of Ethiopia. And they rejoiced there, and they encamped there, because they had reached the border of their country with glory and joy, with tribulation on the road. And all the provinces of Ethiopia rejoiced, for Zion sent forth a light like that of the sun in the darkness wheresoever she came. And they came from the city of the government and encamped at Maya Abau, and on the following morning they laid waste to the district of Zawa and with Hidea, for enmity had existed between them from olden time, and they blotted out the people and slew them with edges of the sword, and they passed on from that place and encamped at Gera, and here also laid waste the city of vipers that had the faces of men and the tails of asses attached to their loins. So we have, again, conquering the queen of Ethiopia in the Kibra Nagast. She is wise, she is intelligent, but she also conquers. She also puts other provinces under her thumb, and then puts them under and taxes them. And the queen returned and encamped in the city of Zion, and they remained there 3 months. Then their wagons moved on and came to the city of the government, and in one day they came to the city of Saba, and they laid waste Noba, and from there they camped around and they laid it waste as far as the border of Egypt. And the majesty of the king of Ethiopia was so great that the king of Medium and the king of Egypt caused gifts to be brought unto him. And they came into the city of the government, and from there they camped at Abat, and they waged war in the country of India. And the king of India brought a gift and a present or tribute, and himself did homage to the king of Ethiopia. Now again, it's not clear at what time period we're speaking of, because this is written in around 1200 AD and it's collecting sources from the past. But it seems, even if one queen did not rule over all these places for thousands of years, it seems to be clear that some of these places did fall under the sway of Cush or ancient Ethiopia at some point. Now is the Gaza which Solomon the king gave to the queen of Ethiopia, and in the Acts of the Apostles, Luke the evangelist word saying he was the governor of the whole country of Gaza and eunuch of Queen Candace, who had believed on the word of Luke the apostle. So again, this idea of Tamrin the merchant, or Tamrin the tax collector, was the governor of the whole country of Gaza and eunuch of Queen Candace. And if they're not referring to Tamrin, then we're talking about somebody else. We're talking about another official. So again, this idea that this woman is not just a figurehead. She has people, men that work under her. And King Solomon answered and said unto them, where is it then that he wisheth to go? And they answered and said unto him, we're not inquired of him, for he is awesome like thyself. But his own people, when we asked them, whence have ye come, and whither do ye go? Said, we have come from the dominions of Candace and Ethiopia, and we are going to the country of Judah to King Solomon. Again, it's written to aggrandize Solomon, so it doesn't. So that's why I would argue it's not going to admit that this is a tour of taxation, that this is a tour of just trade. Also, the Kibra Nagast suggests that, again, that there's greater wealth in Ethiopia than there perhaps is in Israel, which is supported by archaeology. Note that when Makeda visits Israel, but she leaves. Later, Menelik, her son, visits Israel, but then he leaves. Visits twice, and then he leaves. So the riches of Ethiopia clearly compare, and perhaps are as great, if not greater, As for this, my son, this is Solomon speaking. As for this, my son, I will not give him to the queen, but I will make him king over Israel. For this is my firstborn, the first of my race, whom God hath given me. Yeah, well, that's his plan. But the king was not able to make his son consent to remain in Jerusalem with all his persuadings. It is impossible for me to live here. Nay, I must go to my mother, thou favoring me with thy blessing. And also recall Makeda's offense at Solomon's offer that she not take anything from his house. Again, so the wealth of Ethiopia, the desire to return, the desire to leave the Levant is telling. It's factual. It suggests things. It suggests relative wealth and power and prestige. I think the Kib and the gas also. Another factor that suggests that this is a story of taxation is, again, Menelik being made the king of Israel, which is a way to more or less justify giving him things without calling it taxes. It is meet and right that thy dominion of Ethiopia shall be from the river of Egypt to the west of the sun. Blessed be thy seed upon the earth, and from Shoa to the east of India, for thou wilt please the people of these lands. And again his father blessed him and said unto him, the blessing of heaven and earth shall be thy blessing. And all the congregation of Israel said, Amen, or Amen. Again, it's from Chancellor Williams. Joseph Ben Yochanan argued vociferously that amen never meant let it be so. It never meant, there's no evidence that means it meant let it be so. What their argument is that after the Roman and the Greek and the Persians invaded Egypt, that they prohibited the worship of Ammon in territories that they conquered or subordinated. And one of the ways around that would have been to adopt a new religion that is very consistent with your old one, that allows you to say amen or Ammon instead of outwardly breaking the law by practicing the old religion. It's a way to continue it in a new form. But after being made king of Israel, Menelik still returns to Ethiopia. But not only does he return to Ethiopia, he returns with stuff. Right? Again, the suggestion that I am made king, I bring stuff back. This seems like, again, a subordinate taxing relationship. He starts with bringing back the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark that's popularized in all the films, right? In Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. This golden chest that carries the old 10 commandments and the laws of Zion, right? The laws of the people of Israel. And without it, the people of Israel are doomed, right? It symbolizes their togetherness, to be able to, I mean, think about it, the ability to protect it says something about your people. But according to this story, according to the Kib and the gas, the Ark of the Covenant is removed from Israel, removed from Jerusalem by Menelik, the son of Solomon, and brought to Ethiopia. And they blew horns and pipes and trumpets and beat drums and sounded all kinds of musical instruments, and there were singing and dancing and games and displays with horses and shields. And all the men and women of the people of the country of Ethiopia were present, small and great, and the little blacks, 6,000 in number. Let me say that again. And all the men and women of the people of the country of Ethiopia were present, small and great, and the little blacks, 6,000 in number. So again, we understand that when we talk about black folks in Africa, we're talking about the Bantu, what has become the Bantu people that have migrated from the northwest, the northeast, and throughout the country, but that there were also other folks, the Twa, or the Pygmies, right? Or the people that speak in cliques, the Khoikhoi, or the Sand peoples. So the history of Africa is so vast. We're only dealing with, even continent-wide here, we're dealing with a certain I hate to say race of even black folks again, but that's why the concept of a race is so malleable, right? There's so much distinction within Africa. There's greater distinction within Africa than there is between Africans and other peoples. The distinction between the Bantu, the San, the Khoikhoi, and the Pygmies, the difference between those folks is greater than the distinction between Africans and, let's say, Europeans or Asians and all that, because again, they came from us in return. But even if you feel, now the Ark of the Covenant being taken from Jerusalem as a tax, and again, you don't have anything we want. The Queen of Ethiopia already said, I have all the riches, I have all the gold, I have all types of stuff. So when we're going to tax you for your stuff, we need something rare. We want something novel, and then we'll give it. So it seems to be the Ark of the Covenant. Now, of course, lots of people don't believe that. I would say the majority of people probably don't believe that and think it's a mythical statement that Menelik even existed, and that he took that he was the son of Solomon, and that he took the ark by force against their will and brought it back to Ethiopia. As extraordinary as that seemed, I want you to listen to this part, because not only did he take, not only does the Kebra Nagast assert that he took the Ark of the Covenant, that he also took the first sons of the nobles of Israel and brought them back to Africa to have them teach the laws of Zion. And so I want to read this passage, not because it necessarily is true, but I just want you to listen to the level of detail, right? If you're making up a mythological story, it is extremely impressive to come up with this level of detail. Listen to this. And the city rejoiced because the king had made his son king and had appointed him king from his own territory to that of another. But the city sorrowed also because the king had commanded that they should give their children who were called firstborn. So they're trying to make this seem like it's willing and voluntary, but the facts seem to suggest that this is very involuntary, that Ethiopia has conquered and are demanding these things as taxes. And especially after they're through with it, then the country of Judah seems to fall, which also supports the idea that they got, maybe we're overtaxed. So here are the children, the firstborn of Israel, that are removed by Menelik and taken to Axum. Azarias, the son of Zadok, the priest, who was the high priest. Elias, the son of Arni, the archdeacon, now the father of Ami, was the archdeacon of Nathan the prophet. Adram, the son of the Arderonis, leaders of the people. Thankara, the son of Soba, scribe of the oxen. Achenhel, the son of Tophel, the youth. Samanias, the son of Achilletam, the recorder. Ficaros, the son of Naya, the commander of the armed men, the chief of the troops. Lawandos, the son of Akire, commander of the recruits. Fakutin, the son of Adre, commander on the sea. Matan, the son of Banyas, chief of the house. Adaraz, the son of Kiram, servant of decorations. Dalakam, son of Macham, chief of the horse soldiers. Adaros, the son of Nadros, chief of the foot soldiers. Alsteron, the son of Yodad, bearer of the glory. Astarion, the son of Asa, messenger of the palace. Imi, the son of Matatias, commander of the host. Makri, the son of Abisa, judge of the palace. Abis, the son of Carios, assessor of taxes. Likwindios, the son of Nelantios, judge of assembly. Carmi, the son of Hadnias, chief of the royal workmen. Saranias, the son of Akazel, administrator of the king's house. The reason why I listed all of these people is because of the level of detail. It's just hard for me to imagine that this is all made up, that it's all a mythical story, that there was never a time where the princes of Israel, Egypt, or princes of Israel or some Palestine were not brought to Ethiopia as part of a conquering or a tax process. These are all those who were given to David, king of Ethiopia, the son of Solomon, king of Israel. And Solomon also gave him horses and chariots and riding camels and mules and wagons for carrying loads and gold and silver and splendid apparel. Well, that sounds like all the stuff that Makeda brought with her. But all of these gems and pearls and precious stones, he gave his son everything that would be wished for in the country of Ethiopia. So they try to make it seem like this was a gift, but again, my argument is these are taxes. This is involuntary, and here's some more proof to the argument that this was involuntary. They assemble together. This is the people of Israel after Menelik leaves with the ark and the firstborn of Israel. They assembled together and wept, together with their fathers and their mothers and their relations and their kinsfolk and their peoples and their countrymen, and they cursed the king secretly and reviled him because he had seized their sons against their will. Our women shed tears, and our city is laid waste. Woe be unto us, woe be unto us, for them, from this day to the end of our days we must mourn, and our children likewise. Woe be unto us, for the glory of the glorious daughter of Zion is removed, and the glory of the daughter of Ethiopia the vile hath increased. Daughter of Ethiopia the vile. So from her being tall and beautiful in stature and all these other things, she's now called daughter of the Ethiopia the vile. That doesn't sound like they're referring to the mother of their king, to the extent he's been made king of Israel. Well, now, to me, again, did he assert himself as king and tax them? That sounds more likely and would be more natural for them to have a response that the daughter of Ethiopia, having sent her son to collect all this stuff, is vile and her power glory hath increased. Note that the ark had been taken before. Right? If Ethiopia took the ark from Jerusalem, note that wouldn't have been the first time. The ark had previously been taken by, I believe it was the Philistines, concerning Zion in olden time, in the days of Eli the priest, before our fathers had asked for a king. The Philistines carried Zion away captive in their camp, God having neglected Israel in the battle, and his priests, Aphni and Phinehas, having fallen by the edge of the sword. And the Philistines carried away the tabernacle of the law of God and brought it into their city and set it in the house of their god Dagon. So this wasn't the first time that the Ark of the Covenant was taken from the children of Israel, if that is what happened. While Solomon is forgiven by his people, Israel falls after losing the ark. Solomon takes an Egyptian wife and prays to a foreign god, symbolizing the loss of faith and the jurisdiction to be restored. And jurisdiction would then later, 33 generations later, would have to be restored by a Messiah. The quote in the Nagast is, "Thy son hath carried away the lady Zion, thy son whom thou hast begotten, who springeth from an alien people, into which God hath not commanded you to marry." Remember, that was a rule. Jewish Hebrews were not supposed to be marrying outside of their race. That is to say, from an Ethiopian woman who is not of thy color, and it is not akin to thy country, and who is moreover black. And Solomon answered and said unto her, this is actually him responding to his new wife in Egypt. And remember, his new wife is from northern Egypt, near the Mediterranean Delta. And so this also, again, confirms what we've been saying about the power in Egypt moving from the African south up to the north. But Solomon puts her in check for dissing Sheba, right? So his new wife disses Sheba, but he comes back at her saying, though thou speakest thus, art thou not thyself of that race, concerning which God hath not commanded us that we should take wives from it? And thy kin is her kin, for ye are all the children of Ham. So it seems Solomon loves him some black women, right? So my conclusion is the Kebra Nagast and other stories of Solomon and Sheba recast a Torah by the Queen of Ethiopia to lay and collect taxes into a prurient story designed to discredit the majesty of the Candaces, especially as told by patrilineal or patrifocal sources. Because again, even with Solomon marrying this woman from Egypt, one could make the argument that it's Egypt that gets the ability to tax Israel through this marriage and not the other way around. You would think that Israel would have been strengthened by a marriage to an Egyptian princess that would have had access to wealth. But instead, it's a fall of Egypt after marrying to this Egyptian princess, probably because, again, as a member of Greek or Roman or Persian, and at this time, we're probably Roman Egypt, that marriage gives her people the authority to tax him instead of the other way around. We'll skip over. There was a lot in the Kibra Nagast. There's also a long list of laws, so a codification of the new laws of Ethiopia that the Kibra Nagast is supposed to introduce, that are Christian-based, that are supposed to replace those laws that were original by the indigenous people. And again, I don't know if those laws came from the reign of Judith, but it would seem clear that these laws and this assertion of priority for the Kibra Nagast is a way to restrict or to put asunder the memory of this female endogenous queen that inspired a inspired the people in Ethiopia to reject the kingdom or the Solomonic dynasties. Yes, I'm going to skip over because that would take us another couple. Let me just give you a few. And when ye reap the harvest of few, ye shall not be careful to reap all of it. Gather not up with what falleth from it, and the sheaves which ye have forgotten ye leave when ye go back. Ye shall not work impurity. Ye shall not judge with partiality. Ye shall not deal oppressively with one another in anything, so that ye may be blessed, so that the fruit of your land may increase. He who defileth his father's bed is accursed. He who treateth his neighbor with fraud is accursed. He who perverteth justice for the alien so that he may slay innocent blood is accursed. Again, these are features of equal protection, right? The alien, the poor, your neighbors, women, all of these laws, on the other hand, to the extent they are acceptable, definitely represent not only the rule of law, but also a commitment to the equal protection of law. So the major thing that we're getting out of this entire long discussion about who was the Queen of Sheba, what is the story about, how far, what we're trying to figure out is how far did ancient Ethiopia extend? And I hope through this exercise, we understand that at least from the Coptic perspective, and definitely from an Afrocentric perspective, the idea that Ethiopia and Kush were fairly synonymous. There may be times when there is a discussion of Ethiopians that doesn't relate to a state, that relates to just dark-skinned people of Africa, but it just makes that much more sense to, especially when we know that this story is coupled with Ethiopians taxing, or at least my suggestion or hypothesis is this is a story dealing with Ethiopians taxing and having power over peoples from distant lands outside of Africa, that we can, number one, see that there's an extraordinary commitment to equal protection, that it relates to their greatness, right? The wisdom of this queen is what allows her kingdom to reign so very far. That we see another major point is that, again, that the Kibra Nagast is a continuation of the teachings of Mot, teachings of Amenhotep, Ptahhotep, teachings of Kunanup, and most importantly, that selfishness has to be subverted, and autocracy has to be converted. Otherwise, those things produce chaos and disorder, versus impartiality and wisdom that produces order, balance, justice, and fairness, and therefore wealth and longevity. And we understand that through this concept of Mot that we see intertwined through the Ethiopian Empire, Nubian or Kushite Empire, Egyptian empires, we see that they should be counted within the world's absolute greatest empires and nation builders in history. And we've already gone through 3 on the African continent before we talk about the Swahili states: Zimbabwe, Sofala, Cuba, Mali, Kanem, Borno, Angola, Mauritania, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, the Nox civilizations. Again, there's so many, but we've only discussed 3 at this point. Major ones, but just the beginning nonetheless. So let me leave you with this last quote about where the Kibra Nagast suggests that the empire of Ethiopia / Kush extends after during the reign of Queen Makeda and King Menelik. And thus the eastern boundary of the king kingdom of the king of Ethiopia is the beginning of the city of Gaza in the land of Judah, that is Jerusalem, and its boundary is the lake of Jericho, and it passeth on by the coast of its sea to Leba and Saba, and its boundary goeth down to Bisis and Asnet, and its boundary is the sea of the blacks and naked men, and goeth up Mount Cabaranion into the sea of darkness, that is to say, the place where the sun setteth, right? That would be the west. And its boundary extended to the Fennel and the Lasaphala, and its borders are the lands near the Garden of Paradise, where there is food in plenty and abundance of cattle, and near Fennekin, and its boundaries reaches as far as the Zawel, and passeth on to the Sea of India, and its boundary is as far as the Sea of Tarsus, and its remote part lieth the Sea of Midyam, until it cometh to the country of Gaza, and its boundary is the place where our enumeration began, and moreover, the dominion of the king of Ethiopia belongeth to him and to his seed forever and ever and ever. Thank you for listening to episode 12. Again, we'll move forward on episode 13 and start talking about the East Africa and its relationship with the rise of Islam. And we're going to do that through again, a story of a man called Al-Jahiz, who was a member of the Zanj, who were enslaved Africans taken from the area of, let's say, Tanzania, Kenya area, and brought to work in the nation in present-day Iraq, right, off the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. And these people basically had a revolt and took over southern Iraq near Basra and had their own nation for several years. And they instituted a form of Islam that called Kharijitism. And the reason I bring that up is because I believe that that represents, again, that commitment to equal protection of law, where when Africans take a hold of the religion, especially in this case Islam, they infuse it with their own customs, and here the idea that every person, every individual is equal, and that there is and thereby no need to praise or follow the laws of a particular caliph, right, the Pope of Islam, right? So it's deemed a heretical faction of Islam, and yet Kharijitism or Ibitism is replete throughout African Islam, through the Zanj, through the Berbers, through the Moors, through Ghana, Mali, and through Mali and Songhai. So that's where we're going to take it in episode 13. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion today of the Queen of Sheba, Queen Makeda, and the extent of the Ethiopian Empire. Again, as always, let's better educate ourselves and our children. Let's start and patronize black businesses, and let's stop unduly criticizing each other. Let's accumulate human, financial, social, and political capital. Hotep.